Have you ever wondered why your intelligent thoughts and deep conversations seem to attract some women while causing others to visibly recoil? You're discussing books, ideas, or life philosophies, and suddenly you notice her gaze becoming glazed, her fingers nervously checking her phone, or her abruptly changing the subject. What if I told you this phenomenon isn't just your imagination, but has profound philosophical and psychological foundations? The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard recognized something almost 200 years ago that modern psychology now confirms. Genuine intelligence can be threatening, not because it's wrong, but because it demands a freedom and existential responsibility that many people would rather avoid. Take a moment now and recall a conversation where your intellectual depth created discomfort. How did the other person react? What did you feel in that moment? Most of us have learned that intelligence is something desirable, something others should admire in us. Why then does it sometimes trigger fear instead of attraction? To answer this question, we first need to understand who Kierkegaard was and why his insights remain so relevant today. As the first existentialist philosopher, Kierkegaard understood that true intelligence encompasses more than intellectual knowledge. It presents an existential challenge. For him, thinking wasn't just about accumulating facts, but confronting fundamental life questions. How should we live? Which values truly matter? What truths are we fleeing from? Born in Copenhagen in 1813, Kierkegaard wrote during a time of immense social and intellectual change. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were building grand philosophical systems, Kierkegaard focused on the individual's subjective experience. He believed that the most important truths weren't objective facts to be learned, but subjective realities to be lived. This emphasis on personal truth and authentic living makes his philosophy particularly relevant when examining why intelligence can create interpersonal distance. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect on how you yourself react to people who challenge you intellectually. Do you sometimes feel uncomfortable when someone questions assumptions that give you security? Do you occasionally feel the urge to avoid a deep conversation? This reaction is entirely human and affects us all, regardless of gender. Yet the specific dynamics between intellectual men and their female conversation partners have their own nuances, which we'll explore now. The first mechanism Kierkegaard identified is the fear of freedom. In his work, The Concept of Anxiety, he explains that deep thinking confronts us with the dizzying expanse of our freedom. When a man engages in intellectual conversations that question fundamental assumptions, he confronts his conversation partner, consciously or unconsciously, with the fact that many of our truths are merely conventions that we could choose differently. Modern psychology confirms this phenomenon. Psychologist Rollo May described how people often develop mechanisms of escape to avoid the existential anxiety that comes with genuine freedom. Think of this in practical terms. If you show through intelligent analysis that many life choices, from career paths to relationship structures, are social constructs rather than absolute necessities, you're opening up a world of possibilities. But with those possibilities comes responsibility. Suddenly, one can't simply say, "This is just how things are done." Instead, they must make active choices and take responsibility for them. This is what Kierkegaard meant when he wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." The more options we recognize, the more our choices matter, and the heavier the weight of responsibility becomes. Imagine you're talking with a woman about the arbitrariness of social norms, or how career expectations are often just social constructs. What you experience as a liberating insight might represent a threatening questioning of her life choices. Do you notice how this pattern emerges in your own conversations? Next time you're having a profound discussion, consciously observe when your conversation partner begins showing signs of discomfort. It's often exactly at the moment when the discussion leaves the safety of familiar thinking patterns. Here's a first practical tip. Before questioning a conventional thought pattern, first validate the legitimacy of your conversation partner's existing perspective. Say something like, "I understand why this viewpoint makes sense for many people. What fascinates me, though, is also an alternative perspective." This creates a safe space where new thoughts don't seem threatening. Psychological studies in cognitive dissonance theory show that people are more receptive to challenging ideas when their existing views are first acknowledged and respected. Try this exercise tomorrow. In your next deep conversation, make a conscious effort to start with validation before introducing new perspectives. Notice how this changes the emotional atmosphere and receptivity of your conversation partner. You might be surprised by how such a simple shift can transform a potentially threatening exchange into an engaging exploration. The second mechanism is what Kierkegaard called the despair of not wanting to be oneself. Intelligent conversations often lead to self-reflection and confront us with the question of whether we're living authentically. Developmental psychologist Carol Gilligan has shown that women in particular are often socialized through relationship norms that reward adaptation rather than individual authenticity. When a man discusses philosophical ideas emphasizing self-determination and authenticity, this can unconsciously be experienced as criticism of adaptation strategies that have been survival essential for many women. Kierkegaard was deeply concerned with the concept of authenticity, which he explored through his theory of life's three stages: the aesthetic, living for pleasure; the ethical, living by social norms; and the religious, living by personal truth. Most people, he observed, never reach the third stage, instead remaining comfortable in socially approved patterns. When your intellectual conversations press toward authentic living, you're essentially inviting someone to consider whether they're stuck in Kierkegaard's ethical stage, following expectations rather than discovering their own truth. An experiment. Observe how differently people react to the question, are you living the life you truly want to live, or the life expected of you? For some, this question is exciting and liberating. For others, deeply unsettling. Psychologist Jennifer Kunst explains that we all develop a false self that conforms to societal expectations, and confronting our true self can be both alluring and frightening. Here's a second practical tip. When discussing topics like authenticity or self-actualization, first share your own struggles and uncertainties. Say something like, "I constantly struggle with living more authentically myself. Just yesterday, I caught myself." This removes the implicit hierarchical structure from the conversation, where you appear as the enlightened one showing others the way. Vulnerability research by Brené Brown shows that authentic sharing of our own challenges creates psychological safety for others to engage with difficult topics. Challenge yourself this week. Before introducing a challenging philosophical idea in conversation, share a personal story about how you've struggled with that very concept. Keep a mental note of how this affects the other person's willingness to engage thoughtfully rather than defensively. The third mechanism concerns what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith, the recognition that our most important life decisions ultimately rest not on absolute knowledge, but on choices. Intelligent men often question the illusion of certainty by showing that many of our beliefs aren't definitively provable. Cognitive psychology has demonstrated with the concept of ambiguity intolerance that people differ in their ability to tolerate uncertainty. Studies by Sorrentino and Roney show that people with low ambiguity tolerance perceive intellectual conversations that question certainties as threatening. Kierkegaard famously wrote about the leap of faith, the idea that at some point reason reaches its limits and we must make commitments beyond what can be logically proven. While Kierkegaard was specifically addressing religious faith, the concept applies broadly to all significant life choices. When your intelligent conversations highlight the limitations of certainty, you're essentially pointing out that solid ground doesn't exist in the way many people wish it did. For someone seeking security and clear answers, this can feel like you're pulling the rug out from under them. I challenge you. For 1 week, pay attention to how often you express absolute certainties in conversations versus how often you leave room for doubt and nuance. Most intelligent people tend to think in probabilities rather than certainties, a thinking style that can be confusing or disturbing for people with high security needs. Research in cognitive psychology shows that tolerance for ambiguity correlates with both higher intelligence and higher anxiety levels, an important paradox to understand when communicating with others. Here's a third practical tip. When addressing uncertainties or paradoxes, also emphasize the liberating aspects of this insight. Instead of just saying, "Nobody really knows if this career decision is right," add, "And exactly this uncertainty gives us the freedom to choose the path that appeals to us most, instead of searching for a single right answer." Research in positive psychology suggests that framing uncertainty as opportunity rather than threat can significantly reduce anxiety and resistance. The fourth mechanism Kierkegaard identified is the fear of the leap. For him, authentic living requires a leap from reflection to action, a step that can never be fully secured through rational thinking. Modern decision psychology confirms that excessive analysis often leads to decision paralysis. When intelligent men engage in endless analyses and reflections without arriving at concrete actions or conclusions, this can induce a sense of disorientation and existential uncertainty in their conversation partners. Kierkegaard was particularly critical of endless reflection without commitment. In his work, Either Or, he presents two life perspectives: the aesthetic life, characterized by endless possibilities and avoidance of commitment, and the ethical life, characterized by commitment and responsibility. He saw that highly intellectual people often get trapped in the aesthetic stage, endlessly analyzing options without making the leap to committed choice. This pattern in conversation can be exhausting and destabilizing for others. A self-reflection for you. Do you tend to introduce ever new perspectives and levels of complexity in conversations without ever reaching a synthesis or action proposal? Psychologist Laura King has shown that people find meaning primarily through stories, coherent narratives that give events significance. Endless analysis without narrative integration can therefore be experienced as destroying meaning. Here's a fourth practical tip. Always balance intellectual analysis with elements of integration and practical action. After a phase of questioning, you might say, "From these various perspectives, I personally draw the conclusion that," what would you take from this reflection for yourself? Studies in communication effectiveness show that conversations that move from analysis to synthesis to action are judged as both more intelligent and more satisfying than those that remain purely analytical. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. Kierkegaard's deepest insight on this topic lies in his concept of indirect communication. He recognized that profound truths cannot simply be directly communicated, but must be experienced. Neuroscience today confirms that transformative learning happens primarily when we are emotionally engaged and discover insights ourselves, rather than having them explained to us. Here lies the revolutionary potential for your intellectual interactions. True intelligence shows not in lecturing or impressing, but in the ability to create spaces where others can gain their own insights. Kierkegaard deliberately wrote in different styles, sometimes even under different pseudonyms, to engage readers in different ways. Rather than directly telling readers what to think, he created scenarios and questions that led them to discover truths for themselves. This approach wasn't just stylistic. It reflected his deep understanding that the most important truths can't be directly transmitted, but must be personally realized. Imagine how differently your conversations might unfold if you used your intelligence not as a means to display your knowledge, but as a tool for creating shared journeys of discovery. The Socratic method, asking questions rather than giving answers, is not only philosophically profound, but also psychologically brilliant. It respects your conversation partner's autonomy and avoids the threat that can emanate from an all-knowing interlocutor. Now, for the most important practical tip. Transform your intellectual conversations from monologues into shared explorations. Instead of saying Kierkegaard recognized that, ask, what do you think about whether our deepest convictions are ultimately beliefs? Rather than explaining concepts, pose questions that lead to self-discovery. Psychological studies show that people integrate ideas they discover themselves 42% more likely into their thinking than ideas explained to them. Let's see how you can apply these insights in various conversational situations. On a first date, you might be tempted to demonstrate your well-read nature or analytical abilities. Instead, try this approach. Rather than explaining complex theories, ask a single, profound question like what has surprised you recently or changed your perspective. Then truly listen. Studies on attraction show that active, empathetic listening is perceived as more intelligent than impressive talking. In an existing relationship, intellectual inequality can lead to tensions. A practical approach: recognize different forms of intelligence. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences shows that logical analytical intelligence is just one of many forms. You might say, you have remarkable emotional intelligence. You grasp moods and needs that I often overlook. That's a form of knowledge that's harder for me. In professional situations, your intelligence might be perceived as arrogant or know-it-all. Try this technique. Epistemic downgrading. Formulate statements with a certain tentativeness. Based on what I've understood so far. Or, one perspective I find interesting is. Organizational psychology shows that such linguistic patterns increase the likelihood of your ideas being accepted. What Kierkegaard recognized almost 2 centuries ago is more relevant today than ever. True intelligence shows not in knowledge alone, but in the ability to convey knowledge so that it can become personal truth for the other. The challenge isn't to be less intelligent, but to be more intelligent about how you express your intelligence. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe if you want to dive deeper into the hidden truths that shape our relationships and self-understanding.